Greetings and welcome once again to English 111 College Success Skills with me, Mr. Fowler. I'm so happy that you can join with me together today, as we take a look at our next chapter. As always, I like to just take a few seconds at the beginning of each session to explain what we're going to do and what our plan of attack is for today. So bear with me as I share some screenshots with you. All right, let's do this slideshow. Okay, so here I am in the upper right-hand side of your screen monitor, and I just want to go over some of the materials that we're going to cover today in our brief preview. We'll talk real quickly about the self-assessment essays and hopefully lay to bed any questions that you might have remaining in regard to that specific assignment. Then I'll review some key points related to reading and note-taking, the chapters from last week, and then we will lecture today. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the material from this week's reading, Chapter 16, Preparing for Objective Exams, which comes to you from your text, College Success Strategies, pages 203 to 213, about 10 pages, a little bit of a shorter bit of reading for you this week. Once we've discussed those topics in depth or in detail, then you should have some time to set aside for this class session, just a little bit of time, for the week 6 discussion question forums, which you can complete. Okay, that's a brief preview of what's going on. Now let's review. So in terms of review, I thought most of you did a very good job with your self-assessment essay revisions. There were a few questions over the weekend about how to best contact your peer review partner. One thing that I'm going to ask you to think about this week, and in fact, it's a little bit of a preview of yourself, or rather the weekly discussion question is how well did you enjoy that peer review session? How much did you get out of it? Did it seem helpful? And do you have ideas about how we could make the process a little bit more smooth? Like I said, a few people had some trouble finding a link or a way to reach out to a peer review partner. Some other students were just very confused about how to submit a draft to another peer using either the class list link or the file downloading system. That may be something I need to explain a little bit more clearly. That could be on me a little bit. Some of you are still getting that essay into my hands, which is always good to not give up on a particular assignment. And others are still struggling, I think, at this point to get that essay revised. So if you have questions about any of those kinds of things, this week's discussion forum is a good place to express those misgivings or address those concerns to me so that I can tweak my delivery service for the next time we have an assignment like this or just for future courses. Okay, so those are a couple of things I wanted to get out of the way in regard to that assignment. Issue number 2, or topic number 2 as it may be, is in relationship to the note-taking and study skills PowerPoint from last time. And I'm going to bring that up real quickly. So I'm going to share a screen again. And this one, a little different. Essays. Oh, that's the same one. Oh, shoot, hold on. I might have another PowerPoint I have to pull up. Give me a second. I thought I had it up here. I have two of the same one. That's not exactly how I wanted it to go. All right. This is the one that I wanted to share with you. This is from last week. And again, when it came to the idea of creating a good learning environment, part of this process was knowing what worked for you as an individual study student and what may not work for you. Once you know what works for you in terms of the level of noise that's acceptable, the kind of space, that physical space that you need to focus your studies, we talked about ways to get the most out of a particular text, breaking down its constituent elements and studying things like its chapter, headings and subheadings, previewing your reading assignments, and gearing up for the reading task. We said that last time the text asks you a question. Do you find that much of your reading is spent in an unproductive way because you're not concentrating and don't remember what it is you've read? Well, if that's the case, you may not be geared up for reading. So one of the things that they suggest is that once you have noise under control, once you've surveyed your text, once you've previewed the reading assignment, ask yourself questions and determine what your key purpose is in reading. Now that's a theme that we're going to see that returns to today's lesson as well. Active reading, we talked about focusing on the annotation of your textbook because number one, you own your textbooks now, they're yours, and you can use all of that design space to take notes. And number two, annotating your text asks you to take a 3-step approach to the studying process. First of all, you have to select the information that you want to remember, then reduce the amount of material by reading first. Once you've summarized material in your own way or your own voice, you can ask yourself some questions. Specifically, what's important? And a good way to anticipate what important general or large-scale topics might be important would be to look at the headings and subheadings. And we said that all of this process can be a bit time-consuming and can leave a lot up to the imagination. Over time, when used consistently, you'll find that you get much more efficient at selecting material and reading, and you find those good guide questions that'll actually help you study more effectively. Good note-taking is very important because good notes help you to analyze what is most important in a particular lecture situation. And there are certain things that you can do before, during, and after class to enhance your note-taking abilities. First of all, characteristics of good notes. They're typically organized and they focus on main points as opposed to specific details. So they're more broad and general. They also tend to feature examples from the text or from information delivered via the lecture itself. Self-testing questions are a featured portion of very good notes according to our test experts, and most notes use abbreviations to save time. When you're thinking about how to focus on the process of taking notes, we said it's a really good idea to sit in the front and to sit kind of toward the center of the class if the front's not available. You should adjust your notes and your note-taking style for each class, specifically for the style of each instructor. We looked at two broad approaches that instructors will take: deductive and inductive. Now, deductive is a move from very broad parameters to much more specific details. Whereas inductive lecture tends to focus on a number of specific details, and then at the end they generalize in a broad way, connecting the disparate components. Make sure, of course, before you take the notes that you've done the assigned reading. If you don't do that, you really won't know how to structure or focus your notes. Review previous notes before you start each review session, and try to get to class early just so you can have everything ready to go and all of your materials prepared before you begin taking a new set of notes. The best notes use simple paragraph or bulleted lists. You could also use numbered lists, I suppose. The best notes also leave additional space so that you can go back and add more content when reviewing at a later point in time. The best notes are usually also relatively neat, and details are highlighted by the use of space rather than a specific number or abbreviation. Okay. We looked at 4 different styles of note-taking. The first being, whoops, I skipped one, the Cornell method, where you break down questions beforehand, and then you answer the notes as the lecture evolves, and then you summarize each lecture session at a later date. We looked at parallel notes, where you use a professor's pre-printed or pre-designed notes, if available, and then you put those in a 3-ring binder so that the professor's notes face a blank page, and it's on the blank page that you respond to the professor's notes. Discussion columns are really good for in-person and discussion-based sessions so that you can write down questions and then student answers to those questions, noting in the middle column any response that the professor makes to what your fellow students have said. Last but not least is the T method. This is the method that I said I've used the most and I feel actually works for students in a class setting. You should summarize the key points using your own words and then predict some self-testing questions based on the lecture that you listen to. It's used as a simple T-shaped column to divide up the key points and the self-style questions. So self-testing style of questions. Make of that what you will. Okay. Now today we're going to move on, and like I said, we've been jumping around quite a bit in the text, but that's okay. The reason being that I want to get to material that I think you could use right now in some of your other classes this semester. And as test time and midterms are quickly approaching, it might be a good idea to spend the weeks leading up to the midterms discussing how to approach different styles of tests. Now, today we're going to focus on how to prepare for objective style tests, the kinds of quizzes that we've seen for the first 3 to 4 weeks of this course. So let's get started. I am going to mute the video so you won't see my wonderful face for just a few more minutes, but you will hear my voice and then I'll pop back in for the conclusion. All right, let's talk about this session. We've already done our preview and review. Time to move on to our lecture. Chapter 16, Preparing for Objective Exams. And again, this content comes to us from pages 203 to 213 of your text, College Success Strategies. All right. Objective Exams, Chapter 16. Let's begin with some self-study questions. Try it again, self-study questions. What exam preparation strategies work in almost all situations? Well, we're going to talk about that today. And last, how should you prepare for objective exams specifically? So what is meant by objective questions or objective exams? These are the different types of recognition or objective exam questions you might find in those types of quizzes and tests. Anything that would constitute a multiple choice question, a true and false, matching, or fill in the blank type of question, those are all recognition or questions that ask you to memorize specific details of a lesson that you might read or a lecture that you might attend and listen to. Those are all types of objective test questions. Objective questions tend to be, again, recognition questions. So in your text, there's a little box that defines success at a glance. And they have some good ideas about how to capitalize on one's success when preparing for an objective exam. They suggest that when you're preparing to study for an objective exam, you begin by making what's called a jot list, or a quick list of information about key points. Once you have your jot list, you'll use that as a way to organize your information around the broader, large-scale concepts of a particular chapter, section, or group of chapters. You should begin each study session with a review of what you discussed in the previous session. And of course, the book also suggests that you plot out your test preparation in a series of small review sessions rather than one intensive review or one session of cramming for a test. This tends to result in a crash and burn for most students. Therefore, breaking things up into smaller groups and smaller study sessions has been deemed to be a more effective way to study, especially for objective tests. You should rehearse your answers and your content knowledge with students in a peer review session, and then create self-test questions to help guide your focus. Once you've done those things, you should double back, but this time spend the last few minutes of your study session concentrating on the areas of weakness that you still face in your knowledge, and then work on those areas out loud. Maybe ask another student or other friend that you study with if they have a different perspective or a better way to sort of memorize some of this content. Now, once you've begun the study session and you've completed your list of key objectives, it's time to organize that information. To do this, the text suggests that you return to that jot list. Now, in terms of what a jot list looks like, just understand that it's not necessarily a formal design list. It doesn't have to go in a specific order, and it doesn't have to move in a linear sense, covering information that you have absorbed from the beginning to the end of a chapter in a specific sequence. Rather, it forces you to think about concepts before you study. To do this, one of the best suggestions that I've come across in this particular text is to use, again, your chapter headings and subheadings to organize the information. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it was also a suggestion in how to get the most out of the lecture and get the most out of the design of your own notes. So you'll need your notes to create a jot list. And again, your notes should be based on subheading and headings from when you have read the chapter in advance. Now, how do you use the jot list once you've designed it? You can use a jot list to discover ways of planning for group rehearsal strategies. You can also look for overlap so that if you see one or more ideas connected to a larger theme, you can note the significance of how those ideas inform one or another. They use an example in your textbook about the LBJ presidency and the civil rights movement of 1964. When you have your information, focus each study session by honing in on broad concepts, using, of course, your jot list as a guide. Then rehearse and self-test yourself on knowledge that you may still have difficulty with. Concentrate on your weakness and use one final study session before your objective exam or test to focus solely on the gaps in knowledge or weaknesses that you might have in a particular session or unit. Then verbally and out loud talk through remaining difficult ideas so that you can enhance your overall attempts at memorization and clarification by getting some skeletal muscle memory involved. Actually moving the muscles in your jaw, lips, and tongue can create sensory memory that you can rely on in a pinch. I know that sounds kind of silly, but you might be surprised at the ideas if you've never used it before. And who knows, may be successful. Okay, the last or second part of this process involves thinking. So once you've got your information organized, you need to think about how to apply that knowledge. Begin with asking yourself, what's the level of thinking necessary? In other words, what kind of a task are you really facing? This goes all the way back to chapter 2. Remember that when you approach an objective test, it's a little bit more than simple memorization. Now, I'm not going to lie, memorization can help, and it is an important skill to hone over your time here in college, but thinking that memorization alone will help you be successful is kind of a trap. Memorization is good for the kind of factual questions that can be asked in an objective exam. But what about questions that are higher functioning? The type of questions that ask you to apply yourself or synthesize information that you may have learned or use an example. How do you handle that? Well, you have to ask yourself a little bit more about the testing situation itself. How will you work through the individual questions on the test? It's important to have a plan. You shouldn't just sit down at an objective test and start with question number 1 and keep going until you're finished. You should actually break up the time and do so in a very specific way. Some other questions that you might want to consider before you take an objective test is, what are you going to do when you come across something you just haven't studied or maybe slipped through the cracks? What are you going to do when you come across an item that you're just not sure of? You have a pretty good idea, but you're not 100%. How should you approach things like true and false questions? And what in the world will you do if you run out of time? Well, when you run across a question that you are not sure of, try to eliminate as many options as you can. Oops, I went a little ahead. Sorry about that. But we'll talk about guidelines in a bit. So number 1, how are you going to work through the questions? Read through or preview your test. Look for examples of questions that you know. In fact, our authors suggest that you actually read through your test questions until you find an answer that you do know, that you feel comfortable with, and start there. And keep going until you've answered all the questions that you're sure of. Then double back using your remaining time to focus on the questions that you're not sure of, for those questions that you're not sure of. If they're multiple choice questions, ask yourself, can I eliminate any of them? Maybe I can focus on the 2 best choices and increase my likelihood of getting it right. If it's a true or false question, recognize that most of the time there are more true questions than there are false ones. Look for specific wiggle words like absolutely, or terms that are written in bold or italics to indicate a close, or the need for a close reading on a true false question. How do you answer a question when you can't even make an educated guess? This is the toughest question in this lesson. Well, the only evidence that I or your authors can really offer up to you is that sometimes if you study and you make a mistake and you get the wrong material, the best thing you can do is make your first guess your final guess and then move along. Now, if you're running out of time, that is difficult. You should always try to answer all the questions on an objective exam, whether it's using patterns like using the same answer for every question you don't know, or answering all of the questions true, because most of the time there are more true questions than there are false ones. Make sure that you use the most of your time wisely. If there are short answer essay questions combined with objective questions, you may want to answer those first. General guidelines, of course, you got a little preview of these, but they're good ideas. When it comes to actually arriving or preparing for the exam before you actually take it, try to get to class on time so that you're not in a rush or panicked. And get all of your materials ready. If it's an objective exam that allows you to use things like a calculator or notes, or requires a specific pen or pencil, make sure all of those things are ready and available before you sit down to begin the test. And of course, try to practice positive reinforcement. Tell yourself things like, I've studied this and I know it backward and forward, or I'm really psyched to take this exam to show this professor what I know. When you actually get the exam in hand, before you begin, give yourself 1 or 2 minutes to simply look over the exam itself, even before you begin to answer. Ask yourself specifically how many items are on this test, because that way you're going to know what your plan of attack is. You'll have a specific time frame in most scenarios that you have to adhere to, so saving enough time for each of the types of different questions you focus on is a good idea. Then read the first item and keep moving until you find that question that you know the answer to. With regard to multiple choice, once again, you can quickly move your chances to 50-50 by eliminating any silly or strange answers that you might already know don't fit. When you've completed everything that you know, you may want to read the questions that you were successful in and then go back to the ones you skipped, because many times information from other items can help you with those you might not have known in a previous question. As always, use all of the time that you have with an objective exam. Go ahead and read it over a final time, even if it just requires a few more moments of you sitting in a class. And as we stated before, when you do absolutely have to guess, make a selection and don't dwell on it. Move along. Lastly, the authors of our text pause to consider specific types of objective questions, especially those with diagrams. So if you've got a diagram on a test that you need to pay attention to, like a chart or a scale or something like that, be sure that you understand the diagrams before you answer. Talk each question through in your head and read each question pertaining to the diagram first. So read all of the diagram related questions. Then look back to the diagram. And once you've done that, you can begin to answer your questions. Okay, folks, that's the end of this chapter. Real brief one, considering the length of the last PowerPoint, but we've reached the end. So for next time, in the Wednesday session, go ahead and read the next chapter, 17, in your book, College Success Strategies. This one's a little bit longer, 214 to 226. So you might want to save enough time to focus on that amount of reading. We'll have one more of these chapters focused on specific styles of tests next week. But this week we're going to be busy enough focusing on our time with this new material. Again, don't forget to use some of your class time today or at some point during this week to answer the week 5 discussion questions pertaining to your peer review experience. Okay, that's all for me. Now, until next time, I am Mr. Fowler, and I bid you a wonderful day and an even better week. Take care, everyone.